June 4, 1942 dawned with Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo standing on the bridge of his flagship Akagi, watching his aircraft return from their strike on Midway Atoll. Behind him stretched the organized chaos of a carrier flight deck and combat operations, handlers positioning aircraft, ordnance crews wheeling bombs and torpedoes, pilots climbing from cockpits as the morning sun glinted off the Pacific waters. For massive carriers steamed in formation, their decks crowded with planes ready for the next strike. By every measure Nagumo could perceive, the operation was proceeding exactly according to plan. Then a radio operator handed him a message slip timed at 7:28 that morning. The words were simple: enemy ships sighted 240 miles from Midway. Nagumo read the message twice, his face going completely still according to officers who stood nearby, not shocked, not panicked, but motionless as if his mind had suddenly stopped processing the external world and turned entirely inward. For 6 months since Pearl Harbor, the Kido Butai strike force of 4 fleet carriers had ranged across the Pacific like an unstoppable storm. They had struck Pearl Harbor, Darwin, Rabaul, Colombo. They had sunk British capital ships with ease. They had faced no serious opposition that could challenge their dominance. Now here at what was supposed to be a routine operation to capture a small atoll, American ships appeared where no American ships were supposed to be. 10 ships, Nagumo said quietly, almost to himself. His staff officers leaned closer as the admiral looked up from the message. Where are their carriers? No one answered because no one knew. The scout plane that sent the report, launched late due to mechanical problems, hadn't specified what types of ships it had spotted. Below on the flight deck, Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga had just delivered his report from the Midway Strike Group. Second strike necessary, he told air operations staff. Enemy installations still operational. This created an immediate dilemma. When Tomonaga's strike launched before dawn, Nagumo had held back a second wave of 93 planes armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs specifically for use against enemy ships. This was standard Japanese carrier doctrine, maintain a reserve in case enemy carriers appeared. But no carriers had appeared. The morning had been filled instead with ineffective attacks from Midway-based American aircraft, land bombers that missed wildly, torpedo planes that came in slow and were shot down easily. Nothing suggested a carrier threat was nearby. So at 7:15, Nagumo made a fateful decision: rearm the reserve aircraft with land bombs for a second strike on Midway. Ordnance crews across all 4 carriers began the complex, time-consuming work of removing torpedoes, wheeling them to storage, and bringing up land bombs. Then came that message about enemy ships. Commander Minoru Genda, the brilliant air operations officer who had planned Pearl Harbor but now lay burning with fever in his cabin, received the news and pushed himself up on his elbows. What types? He demanded immediately. When told the types were unknown, his fever-flushed face tightened. If there are carriers, he said, we must launch immediately, even if we only have the aircraft currently ready. But Nagumo didn't launch. He waited. 15 minutes passed, then 20. The Akagi's deck was full of aircraft returning from the Midway strike, landing one after another. Handlers rushed to move them below or push them aside to clear space. You couldn't launch a strike with a deck full of landing aircraft, you had to recover them first. And the scout still hadn't reported ship types. At 7:45, a second message arrived: enemy is composed of 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers. Visible relief passed across Nagumo's face. Cruisers and destroyers, not carriers. That was manageable, exactly the kind of target his torpedo-armed aircraft were designed to destroy. Except his aircraft were no longer armed with torpedoes. They were being rearmed with land bombs. Nagumo turned to his staff. Rearm with torpedoes, he ordered. Prepare to attack the enemy surface force after we recover the Midway Strike Group. So ordnance crews who had spent the last half hour removing torpedoes and loading land bombs now reversed course. Remove the land bombs, bring back the torpedoes. It was just after 8 o'clock. The Midway strike aircraft were still landing. The reserve aircraft, twice rearmed now, sat in the hangars while crews worked frantically. Torpedoes and bombs lay scattered across hangar decks, stacked against bulkheads, placed wherever there was room because there was no time to return them properly to magazines deep in the ships. Then at 8:09, a third message from the scout plane, enemy force accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. Appears to be, not definitely is, but appears to be. Nagumo stared at the message. Around him, his staff officers went very quiet. Captain Taijiro Aoki, the Akagi's commanding officer, stepped closer. "Admiral," he said carefully, "if there is a carrier, we should launch immediately." "With what?" Nagumo's voice was sharp. "Half our aircraft are returning from Midway and need to land. The other half are being rearmed. The decks are full." He gestured toward the organized chaos visible through the bridge windows. The choice was stark: launch a partial strike with whatever was ready immediately, or wait 1 hour, recover everyone, complete the rearming, and launch a full coordinated strike. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, commanding the 2nd Carrier Division from the carrier Hiryu, saw the same situation and reached a different conclusion. He sent a message by signal lamp to Nagumo's flagship: "Consider it advisable to launch attack force immediately." Yamaguchi was aggressive, known for it, respected for it. He had argued before the battle that Japan should strike with 6 carriers, not 4, should bring overwhelming force. Now he argued for immediate action, even if partial. Launch whatever you have ready. Get aircraft into the air. Hit them before they hit you. But Nagumo was not aggressive. He was cautious, methodical, a man who had risen through the ranks by not making mistakes. He looked at Yamaguchi's message and made his choice: wait, recover all aircraft, complete the rearming, launch a full coordinated strike. It was the doctrinally correct decision. It was what the manual said to do. It was what his training and experience told him was right. So they waited. The Midway strike aircraft landed one after another. Tomonaga's plane touched down last at 8:30, trailing fuel from a ruptured tank. Handlers pushed aircraft into position. Refueling crews ran hoses. Ordnance crews continued rearming in the hangars below. The 4 carriers steamed through calm seas, their decks crowded with planes, their hangars full of ordnance, their crews working at maximum speed to prepare for a strike they now knew was coming against an American carrier force somewhere out there doing exactly the same thing. At 9:18, the first American aircraft arrived. Not dive bombers or level bombers, but torpedo planes, 15 Douglas Devastators from the carrier Hornet flying low and slow approaching from the east. The Japanese combat air patrol of Zero fighters circling overhead dove on them immediately. What followed was a slaughter. The Devastators, obsolete and slow, tried to bore in through walls of anti-aircraft fire and swarms of Zeros. They dropped their torpedoes from too far out. Every torpedo missed. 11 of the 15 aircraft were shot down. The survivors limped away. On Akagi's bridge, Nagumo watched the attack with grim satisfaction. "American torpedo planes," he said to his staff. "Poorly coordinated, ineffective." It was true. The attack had been brave but futile. Not one torpedo hit, not one Japanese ship damaged. If this was what the Americans had, then Japan's advantage in training and equipment remained overwhelming. But the torpedo planes kept coming. At 9:25, 14 more Devastators appeared, these from Enterprise. The Zeros and anti-aircraft guns tore into them. 10 were shot down, their torpedoes missed. Then at 9:35, 12 more from Yorktown. The pattern repeated: brave, doomed attacks that drew Japanese fighters down to wave height, that pulled the combat air patrol out of position, that focused every gun and every eye on the low-altitude threat coming in at masthead level. Which meant no one was looking up. At 10:22, Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey, leading dive bombers from Enterprise, rolled his SBD Dauntless into a 70-degree dive from 14,000 feet. Behind him, 32 more dive bombers followed, splitting into 2 groups. They had been searching for the Japanese carriers for over an hour, running low on fuel, about to turn back when McCluskey spotted a Japanese destroyer racing northeast and decided to follow it. The destroyer was Ayrshire, hurrying to rejoin the carrier force after dropping depth charges on an American submarine. It drew McCluskey directly to the carriers. Now he dove on Akagi, and the Japanese didn't see him coming until he was already halfway down. On the bridge, a lookout suddenly screamed, "Dive bombers!" Nagumo spun around, looked up, and saw them, dark shapes plummeting out of the sun, growing larger with terrifying speed. What he said in that moment no one recorded exactly. The bridge erupted and shouted orders. "Hard rudder! Full evasion!" The Akagi began to turn, her massive hull responding slowly. Too slowly. The dive bombers came down in a steep, screaming dive, and Nagumo could only watch as they released their bombs. The first bomb missed, exploding in the water close alongside. The second hit amidships, penetrating to the upper hangar deck. The third hit near the aft elevator. 2 bombs out of 3 dropped on Akagi, each weighing 1,000 pounds, each penetrating deep into the ship before exploding. On the hangar deck where ordnance crews had been rearming aircraft for the past 2 hours, where torpedoes and bombs lay stacked against bulkheads, where fuel lines ran and aviation gasoline pooled, the bombs detonated among fully fueled, fully armed aircraft. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. Secondary explosions ripped through the hangar. Aviation fuel ignited. Torpedoes cooked off. Within seconds, the entire hangar deck was a sea of fire. Nagumo felt the ship shudder. Smoke began pouring from elevator openings. An officer ran onto the bridge, his face blackened. "Hangar deck is on fire! Multiple explosions! We're losing pressure on the fire mains!" Before Nagumo could respond, another lookout shouted. The admiral turned and saw 1,000 yards to starboard the carrier Kaga, sister ship to Akagi, the second largest carrier in the fleet, with 4 geysers of water erupting around her. Then he saw the bombs hit. 4 direct hits in rapid succession. Kaga's flight deck erupted in flames. Her hangar deck exploded. Within a minute, she was burning as fiercely as Akagi. And then Soryu, the third carrier, smaller, faster, maneuvering desperately. 3 bombs hit her in quick succession. Her flight deck peeled back like paper. Fire gout from her hangar. 3 carriers hit within the span of 6 minutes, all burning, all doomed. On Akagi's bridge as smoke began to seep in and the deck tilted slightly beneath his feet, Nagumo stood frozen. An officer grabbed his arm. "Admiral, we must transfer your flag. The ship is lost." "Lost?" Nagumo repeated the word as if he didn't understand it. "How can she be lost?" "We were just..." He stopped. Around him, officers shouted damage reports. The fire was out of control. The engine room still functioned, but the ship couldn't fight fires and couldn't launch aircraft. She was a floating torch. Captain Aoki appeared, his uniform torn, his face grim. "Admiral, I request permission to remain with the ship. You must transfer to a cruiser and continue directing the battle." "The battle," Nagumo said. He looked out at Kaga burning, at Soryu burning, 3/4 of his carrier's strength gone in 6 minutes. He turned to his staff. "Where is Hiryu?" "Hiryu is undamaged," an officer reported. "She was separated from the main formation. The American dive bombers didn't find her. 1 carrier left. 1 out of 4. Nagumo nodded slowly. "Signal Hiryu. She is to launch all available aircraft immediately and attack the American carriers." At 10:28, 6 minutes after the dive bomber struck, Nagumo and his staff climbed down from Akagi's bridge and made their way to the flight deck. The forward part of the ship was relatively clear of smoke, and a destroyer, Nowaki, came alongside. Nagumo crossed over on a line, hand over hand, the commander of the Kido Butai abandoning his flagship while she still floated, still moved through water under her own power, but burned so fiercely she could not be saved. From Nowaki's deck, Nagumo watched his flagship burn. An officer standing nearby later recalled that the admiral said nothing. He simply stared at Akagi, at the smoke pouring from her, at the flames visible through hangar deck openings, and his face showed no expression at all, not grief, not anger, not shock, just a terrible blank emptiness. 300 miles to the west, aboard the battleship Yamato, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto received the first reports at 11 o'clock. He was in the operations room when a communications officer entered and handed him a message slip. Yamamoto read it, his face impassive behind reading glasses. Then he read it again. He removed his glasses, folded them carefully, set them on the table. "All carriers?" he asked quietly. 3 confirmed heavily damaged and burning, Sir. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu. Hiryu is undamaged and launching a counterattack. Yamamoto stood motionless for a long moment. His chief of staff, Rear Admiral Mato Ugaki, stood beside him watching the admiral's face. Ugaki would later write that Yamamoto's expression in that moment was as if he had aged 10 years in 10 seconds. The architect of Pearl Harbor, the man who had warned Japan not to fight America but then planned the operation that started the war, now faced the consequence of his own strategy. He had gambled everything on destroying American carriers at Midway and removing the threat to Japan's defensive perimeter. In 6 minutes, the gamble had failed. "What is Nagumo's situation?" Yamamoto asked. "He has transferred his flag to the cruiser Nagara. He's attempting to direct operations from there." Yamamoto nodded. "Order all forces to continue the operation. We will support Nagumo with the main body. If Hiryu's strike succeeds, we may still achieve our objective." But even as he gave the order, Ugaki could see Yamamoto didn't believe it. The admiral sat down heavily, and for the next several hours as reports came in, he said very little. He issued orders, made decisions, maintained the appearance of command. But something had broken. Officers who served with him for years said they had never seen him like this, not angry, not agitated, just profoundly, deeply quiet. On Hiryu, the last surviving Japanese carrier, Rear Admiral Yamaguchi received news of the 3 carriers with a sharp intake of breath. He was on the bridge preparing to launch his strike when the report came in. 3 carriers burning, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu. Yamaguchi's response was immediate and characteristic: launch everything. Every aircraft we have. Hit them with everything. At 10:54, 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters launched from Hiryu. At 12:45, they found the American carrier Yorktown and hit her with 3 bombs. Yamaguchi, receiving the report, allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. "Good," he said. "Now launch the torpedo strike." At 1:30, 10 torpedo planes and 6 fighters launched from Hiryu. At 2:43, they hit Yorktown with 2 torpedoes. The American carrier, already damaged from bomb hits, went dead in the water. To Japanese pilots returning to Hiryu, she looked finished. Yamaguchi stood on his bridge receiving reports, and for a brief moment it seemed possible that Hiryu alone might turn the battle. 1 American carrier damaged, possibly sinking. If they could find and hit the other American carriers, if they could launch another strike before dark, if the Americans didn't find Hiryu first. But the Americans did find Hiryu. At 5 o'clock, dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown arrived overhead. Yamaguchi looked up, saw them coming, and reportedly said just one word: "Shirmata." Damn! 4 bombs hit Hiryu in rapid succession. Her flight deck exploded. Her hangar caught fire. Within minutes, she was burning as fiercely as the other 3 carriers. Yamaguchi stood on the bridge as smoke poured in, as the deck tilted, as officers reported fires were out of control. He turned to his staff. "All personnel will abandon ship. I will remain." His staff officers protested. Captain Tomio Kaku, Hiryu's commanding officer, said he would remain as well. "We will stay with the ship," Kaku said. Yamaguchi shook his head. "The staff will transfer and continue operations." That is an order. But he himself would not leave. He was the carrier division commander. These were his ships. 3 had burned and sunk. The fourth was burning now. He would not survive them. As the sun set on June 4, 1942, all 4 Japanese carriers were burning or sunk. Akagi burned through the night and was scuttled by torpedo the next morning. Kaga sank that evening. Sorya sank at 7:13 that evening. Hiryu burned through the night and sank at 9:12 the next morning. With them went 248 aircraft, 3,057 men, and Japan's ability to project power across the Pacific. On the cruiser Nagara, Nagumo sat in a borrowed cabin staring at nothing. Officers came and went, bringing reports, asking for orders. He responded mechanically, giving necessary commands, but witnesses said he seemed absent, his mind somewhere else. At one point, an officer heard him say very quietly, as if to himself, "How did they know? How did they know we were coming?" It was the right question. The Americans had known because they had broken Japan's naval code. They had read the messages, known the plan, positioned their carriers northeast of Midway, and waited. Nagumo had steamed into an ambush believing he had surprise, believing Americans were reacting to him, when in fact they had been waiting for him all along. Every assumption he had made, that American carriers were far away, that Midway was lightly defended, that Japan still held the initiative, every assumption had been wrong. On Yamato, Yamamoto received final reports as night fell. All 4 carriers lost. The American carriers still operational. The invasion of Midway impossible without air cover. At 2:55 in the morning on June 5, he issued the order, "Occupation of Midway is cancelled. All forces will withdraw." Ugaki, standing beside him, watched the admiral's face as he gave the order. He looked, Ugaki wrote later, like a man who had just signed his own death warrant. Yamamoto had promised the Emperor and Naval General Staff this operation would destroy the American carrier force and secure Japan's defensive perimeter. Instead, he had lost 4 carriers and gained nothing. The war, which Japan had been winning for 6 months, had just turned. In weeks after Midway, as the scale of disaster became clear, Japanese naval officers struggled to explain what had happened. How had 4 carriers been destroyed in 6 minutes? How had Americans appeared at exactly the right place and time? Some blamed bad luck, the late launching scout plane, the decision to rearm aircraft, the timing of American attacks. Some blamed Nagumo's caution, Yamaguchi's absence from main formation, the doctrine requiring recovering aircraft before launching a strike. But in private conversations, in letters and diaries, a different realization emerged. Commander Mitsuo Fushida, the air operations officer who had led Pearl Harbor attack and spent Midway in Akagi's sick bay recovering from appendicitis, wrote later, "We had assumed we held the initiative. We had assumed Americans were reacting to us. We had assumed surprise was on our side. Every assumption was wrong. They knew we were coming. They were waiting for us. We steamed into an ambush believing we were hunters when we were actually prey." This was the fundamental shock, the realization that shattered Japanese confidence. For 6 months, Kido Butai had operated with impunity. They had struck where they wanted, when they wanted, an enemy had been powerless to stop them. That era ended at Midway. Americans had not just won a battle, they had demonstrated they could read Japanese intentions, predict Japanese movements, position forces to counter them. The entire Japanese strategy, rapid expansion, defensive perimeter, force preservation, depended on maintaining initiative. At Midway, Japan lost it and never got it back. Nagumo returned to Japan in disgrace. Though not formally punished, he was given shore commands, kept away from carrier operations, eventually sent to Saipan where he committed suicide in 1944 as American forces overran the island. Yamaguchi went down with Hiryu, one of few Japanese admirals to die in combat. Yamamoto continued as commander of Combined Fleet but was killed in April 1943 when American fighters guided by decoded messages intercepted and shot down his aircraft. But on evening of June 4, 1942, as 4 carriers burned and sank into Pacific, the Japanese admirals who witnessed disaster struggled to articulate what they felt. It wasn't just shock at losses, though losses were catastrophic. It wasn't just fear of consequences, though consequences would reshape war. It was something deeper, the sudden vertiginous realization that everything they believed about their position, their advantage, their inevitable victory was wrong. Captain Aoki, who survived Akiji's sinking and was rescued from water, was asked years later what he remembered most about that day. He thought for a long moment. "The silence," he said finally. After bombs hit, after explosions, there was a moment of complete silence on bridge. We all just stood there looking at each other, and no one said anything because what was there to say? We had just watched our entire strategy burn. That silence,